Hello, on behalf of WIEGO, I'd like to thank UN Women for this historic event and to all of you for being here today. It's an honor to be here. We are here to discuss the experience of our network in the aftermath of pandemic-related lockdowns imposed in March and April of 2020. The WIEGO network includes membership-based workers' organizations from sectors of informal employment where women are overrepresented. Those organizations have witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of the pandemic on women workers from its earliest days. At that time, at the beginning of the crisis, from our members and affiliates across the world, we heard an immediate call for a study to document the impact that they were experiencing. And the call was for a study that was systematic and global in scope, but would build on the foundation of deep connection with women workers and their organizations that's been forged over the course of our 24-year history. So this is what makes our study unique. Workers and their organizations were partners from the beginning in the design and implementation of the study, and their points of view are central both to the study's methodology and to its findings. Today, we'll have the benefit of hearing from leaders of global networks of domestic workers, street vendors and market traders, home-based workers, and waste pickers. And they will discuss some summary findings of our 12-city study, but also go beyond the study in relating the findings to their experiences since the study was conducted, as well as other sources of data and what they're hearing from their affiliates across the world. For members of the audience who are interested in further details on the research itself, WIEGO and IDRC Canada will hold a formal study launch on Monday, July 12th that will drill down into the nuances of the research findings. But for today, we'll focus on how the key findings relate to the network's experiences. So to begin, I'll share just a few key findings from round one of the study across the full sample. Round one was conducted between June and August 2020, and it included workers from 12 cities across 5 regions and all 4 of those sectors I mentioned. And I'll just relate again a few key findings to give the flavor of the initial impact of the crisis, and then turn it over to our panel of speakers. In round one, we asked about 3 points in time. The first, pre-COVID, which in most cases was in February, the peak lockdown period in each locality, which in most places was April, and post-lockdown around July or so of last year. Round two of the study is being conducted now, 1 year after that period last July. So what we found at the very outset was 70% of the workers we interviewed reported 0 earnings during the peak lockdown period. So this figure reflects the extremely vulnerable situation that workers in the informal economy were in before the crisis hit. Their livelihoods were critically dependent on the movement of people and goods. We also found that the majority of workers in the majority of cities needed to engage in at least one sort of asset depleting strategy in order to cope with those lockdowns. So that included drawing down savings, borrowing money, or selling off assets in order to get through that initial period when most were not working. And then after that, only some were able to return to work. And on average, earnings across the full sample were only 55% of earnings before the pandemic hit by mid-year. So what all of this tells us is that the road to recovery is very long for these workers, and the needs for recovery need to be really built from the bottom up. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn it over now to our distinguished panel of speakers to discuss sector-specific issues. And I'm honored to introduce these panelists now. We'll first hear from Myrtle Vitboy, the president of the International Domestic Workers Federation, or IDWF. Then we'll hear from Jonavi Dave, the International Coordinator of HomeNet International, Oksana Aboud, International Coordinator of StreetNet International, and then Lucia Fernandez, WIEGO's Global Coordinator for Waste Pickers. Over to Myrtle first. The floor is yours, Myrtle.
Good morning, everybody from windy and Cape Town here in South Africa. I am representing the IDWF, and we have got 81 affiliates in 63 countries. And we are also working very closely with WIEGO, which is our alliance. 2 years ago, we never imagined what would take place in the world for domestic workers. We find domestic workers going into an unknown world. What we decided is to do a research, but the research was not going to be done by researchers. The research was going to be done by domestic workers themselves that will interview other domestic workers. In that way, we will have honest answers from domestic workers. We did several countries. We did Africa, Latin America, MENA, and Asia. What we find and how domestic workers respond. Sometimes it was very tearful and sometimes it was great because domestic workers are proud of themselves and domestic workers always manage to get themselves out of all situations. But what we find is that many domestic workers was locked in the backyards of their employers. They had no connection to the outside world, and because of that, many abuse and victimization and discrimination could take place. We also find ourselves with domestic workers that has no jobs, domestic workers that lost income, domestic workers that have their children at home and have to provide for their children. However, we also lately discussed a lot of social protection. Yes, in some countries we do have social protection, but even if we do have that social protection, we have no guarantee that domestic workers are included in that social protection. So what happened in this world? We have to start thinking of domestic workers, and we have to start thinking of how we can go back into this world. We often find ourselves being accused by employers that we are the cause of the pandemic. We often find ourselves, isolated and not knowing what to do. So we decide, with the help of the IDWF, with WIEGO, we also provide support for domestic workers. We also see that domestic workers can at least go forward. But what is there for us to do in this world? We need to put ourselves together. We need to uplift our spirits. We need to take back this world that's being taken away from us. And to do that, we need a lot of help. We need governments to start getting involved in the sector. We need to get the assurance that we are part of the economy and that we are adding to that economy. And for that recognition, we need the Convention 189 to become a reality for domestic workers. We need to ensure that that convention is working for us. However, many of these conventions that have been ratified is still stuck in drawers and in cupboards. It does not work for us. So we have a great task ahead. We have a great task of how do we make all that clauses in the convention a reality for domestic workers. They talk about social protection. They're talking about how social protection, social security will include the vulnerable sector, domestic workers. We have to ensure that domestic workers are part of the social protection. We have to ensure that domestic workers have decent wages. We have to ensure that domestic workers are working. We have to ensure that the Kavala systems and all their systems are made away with. We have to ensure that domestic workers can live a normal life. So the way forward, we find ourselves in a world of technology. We find ourselves in the deep end. We had no understanding of technology. We had no understanding of gig economies. We had no understanding of platforms. Now, how are we going to conquer this world? Domestic workers are very clever. Sometimes we may not be able to read and write, but we've got a clever brain. And we need to move into that world now. If we want to be part of the economy, if we want to be part of the world of work, if we want to have decent work for all, we have to move in that direction. So our call will be, we need all the governments on board. We need much more ratifications of Convention 189. But we also need ratification of Convention 190 because domestic workers are open for abuse. And when we get abused, we don't have evidence because we work in isolation. We always have evidence against us, and that we need to have online, we need to have workshops where domestic workers can, when they press a number, they know what is happening in that house. We need to ensure that the employer's home is a fair home. We need to ensure that the compensation is there for domestic workers when they get hurt. Like South Africa, we also find out that Mexico was giving security for their domestic workers. So Mexico must take the lead, other governments must follow. So this morning I'm sitting in front of you. I am saying to the governments in the world, I'm saying to the organizations, that big federations, come join the domestic workers. Come help us. Don't always give us lip talk. Don't always tell us that, yes, you are important. Show us that we are important. Show us that we are part of this economy. Together and united, we will become such a strong workforce. I thank you for giving me this opportunity this morning. I thank WIEGO for being so supportive. I thank all of those. But unless we're going to act, unless we're going to make sure that domestic workers are going to be forward in this new world, because the pandemic is going to be with us for a long way. So the social protection. In South Africa, we have to fight hard to get the compensation. We can't afford to lose it like many other countries. So let us ensure social protection, Convention 189, Convention 190 are really going to make an impact on the lives of domestic workers. Let us go forward. Let us domestic workers understand that that cell phone that they've got in their hand is no more about going to work and being calling to work. It's about empowering themselves to understand the changes in the world that we live in. The IDWF is there to stay. The IDWF is an organization that is led by women. And as women, we know we are strong. And together we will conquer. I thank you all. I wish you well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Myrtle. I'd now like to hand over the floor to Genevieve.
Jambi, you are mute. I can hear you. No?
Just one moment while we fix the sound.
It seems she's speaking, but very weak voice.
I can hear. As if the microphone was off, no?
No. Can you hear me well, Lucia?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me suggest that we hand over the floor to Oksana, and while we sort out Genevieve's sound problem. Over to you, Oksana. We'll come back to you, Genevieve.
Thank you very much, dear Sally. Hello, everyone. My name is Oksana But. I am StreetNet International Coordinator. StreetNet International is a global alliance of membership-based organizations of street vendors, market vendors, mobile vendors, and cross-border traders, uniting over 600,000 members from 52 countries around the world. So StreetNet International has been launched in Durban City, South Africa in November 2002. StreetNet exists to promote the exchange of information and ideas on critical issues facing our main constituency, on practical organizing and advocacy strategies, as well as to build international solidarity among all the workers and informal economy workers to strengthen their voice and visibility at all levels. As for the study that Sally has mentioned about earlier, so StreetNet affiliated organizations also participated in the study, and there were two particular organizations. One was Informal Hawkers and Vendors of Ghana, and the other one was Self-Employed Women's Association, which is called SEVA from India. So across those 9 cities, the vast majority, which is 80% of street and market vendors, were not able to work during the peak lockdowns or restrictions in April 2020. But there was significant variation in the ability to work across the study cities. So the most commonly cited reasons for not being able to work in April 2020 were stay-at-home orders or restrictions, comprising 85% of respondents, disruptions in markets or supply chains amounting in 54%, and health concerns and precautions, which amounts on 39% of the respondents. Among those who tried to work during the peak lockdowns, around 1/4 or 26% reported that they were prevented from doing so by local police or law enforcement bodies. And in a number of cities such as Accra from Ghana, Durban from South Africa, Delhi and Ahmedabad from India, vendors and traders who sold food were recognized as providing an essential service. And this is actually was rather a good achievement, I would note. Yet even among this group, actions by law enforcement agencies prevented most from working through denial of special permits, harassment, or even very brutal violent actions. While the majority of street vendors and market traders had resumed their work by mid-2020 after some easing of restrictions, weak markets and supply chains meant that many could not effectively work or earn at least the same level of income as they used to before the COVID pandemic started. Across sample, 86% reported that their sales were still low compared to pre-COVID-19 period, or like before February 2020. And 70% reported that it had become even harder to purchase any stock. And of those who reported that the price of their stock had increased, more than half reported that their selling price had not increased. And the vendors themselves, they even couldn't do it because the consumption level has dramatically reduced. Due to strict lockdowns, all the street vendors and market traders, they were not allowed to sell their products, and majority of their customers even, they started to buy from the supermarkets, even though the prices there were extremely high, especially for the most vulnerable categories of workers or even the population in general. So especially in April 2020 and also by mid-2020, a lower percentage of women than men, street and market vendors, they were able to work. In April 2020, the average earnings of both women and men street market vendors had declined to roughly 15% compared to pre-COVID-19 average earnings. But by mid-2020, male vendors enjoy a higher recovery of average earnings. So in general, this actually, despite the fact that this study only covered few cities, but it clearly demonstrates all the challenges for street and market vendors, more or less similar for each country, especially in the global south, where informality comprises more than 60 or even 70% of the total labor force. And lack of recognition of street vendors as workers by national legislations prevents them from any social protection coverage and any existing social protection schemes, especially during such crisis period like COVID-19. There is a big need for rearranging the focus on labor market and employment policy development, which should be inclusive and adequate to make sure that no one is left behind. Because nothing for us is without us. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Oksana, for your excellent intervention. Can we try Genevieve?
Sure, Sally, can you hear me now? Is this
Yes.
better? Oh,
Please,
all
yes,
right.
please, go ahead.
Yes.
All right, thanks a lot. So thank you, Sally, for giving me the floor, and thank you, WIEGO, for conducting this very important study. Despite the large informal economy that we have, very little has been done to understand the impact of COVID-19 on the informal economy workers, and especially the women workers. I'm representing here HomeNet International. It is a global network of home-based worker organizations. We are the most recently formed global network. We were launched only this February. We represent 36 home-based worker organizations from 20 countries, collectively representing over 600,000 home-based workers. The aim of our network is to raise visibility and gain recognition for home-based workers, build and provide solidarity amongst home-based workers around common issues, and use the power of global voice to influence governments and employers globally. Now, focusing back onto the study which Sally mentioned, HNI affiliates also participated in this study, and we had Federation of Informal Workers in Thailand, HomeNet Thailand, Renata from Peru, Self-Employed Women's Association, Seva Delhi, and Save from India. Now, this study also, had a very good impact where HomeNet South Asia, a regional organization with the support from WIEGO and IDRC, conducted a similar study in 7 South Asian countries to understand the impact. But here I'll focus more on the study that Sally's mentioned. The study contains very rich data, and one can look it into a lot more detail. But due to paucity of time here, I'll only focus on 4 data points, and I will encourage all of you to actually go for the launch of this study, which is on July 12th. Now, the first data point that I'd like to mention here is around income. Now, amongst the 4 main sectors which the study had taken, which was street vendors, domestic workers, waste pickers, and home-based workers were least able to work during the peak lockdowns or restrictions and the slowest to recover. By mid-year, the workers were making on an average 40% of their pre-COVID earnings. Here, I'd like to mention that there are 2 categories of home-based workers. The own account home-based workers who have direct access to markets and raw materials, and the other category is the piece rate workers or the home workers as we know them, who are dependent for their work on a series of subcontractors or intermediaries and are paid on a piece rate basis. Now, what happened during COVID-19 and the lockdown thereafter was that the supply chains were severely disrupted and thereby the access to work for home workers. Over 1/4 of all home-based workers in the sample reported that the reason they could not work was that they had no work orders or their work orders were cancelled. By mid-year, these disruptions to supply chains became primary reason for work stoppages and low earnings amongst this group. For own account home-based workers, over 1/5 reported that they had no buyers altogether. Now here, for years, we've been trying to work on minimum wages for home-based workers, and in some countries, even living wages. And with the COVID-19, we've been pushed back. All our efforts that we've made in the last 5 years have pretty much gone down the drain because there's no work. Now, across 5 cities, nearly 80% of home-based workers reported drop in selling prices or piece rates for the finished goods compared to pre-COVID-19. The data is across 5 cities. However, in some cities, the situation was very grim, like in the city of Tirupur, which is a garment hub where home-based workers work at the bottom of the garment supply chains. Nearly half of them responded that they had 0 earning during the month of April, which was the lockdown. But the surprising fact is that they reported almost 2/3, almost 68% reported 0 earning even in June, which was not a lockdown period. The next finding is more around recovery, but this study was, this finding is more from the South Asian study that we did, that while home-based workers' recovery was slow, there was a little ray of hope. In terms of members who were part of cooperatives and producer companies, the recovery was definitely much faster than home-based workers who are not part of these cooperatives. They were, these organizations were quick to reorganize their supply chains from, say, garment to food sector, and from global supply chains to local supply chains. Like, for instance, from making fashion garment products, they moved to making masks and PPEs. Now, the third finding, and this is very important for home-based workers, is around unpaid care work. While paid work reduced for home-based workers, unpaid work increased for 70% of home-based worker respondents. Due to the pandemic and the families staying at home at all times, home-based workers saw an increase in time spent on cleaning work by almost 47%, and 67% increase in childcare responsibilities, which includes time spent on creating access to online education. Now, I'm not, because there's really no time, but I'm just going to touch upon a little bit here, is that last finding was around social protection. Just to mention that the savings depleted, debts increased, and food crisis became a reality for most home-based workers. Just to mention, in a city of Tirupur, 33% drew on the savings, 27% sold assets, and 72% had to borrow money. This was also, like what Oksana mentioned, home-based workers also don't have any legislation. There's no recognition, and therefore there was no social protection for them either. Universal social protection, whichever country had that and home-based workers could access it, those are the only home-based workers who were able to recover or on the path of recovery. So I'm going to pause here and hand it over to Sally. Over to you, Sally. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jahnavi. I'd like to turn the floor over now to Lucia. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you all. My name is Lucia Fernandez. I coordinate the Global Alliance of Waste Speakers, which is a networking process supported by WIEGO since 2008 now, where we first organized the World Conference of Waste Speakers in Bogota, Colombia. And now we have more than 100 of Waste Speakers organizations with groups in more than 28 countries, covering mainly Latin America, Asia, Africa, Europe, and most recently North America as well. The affiliates participated in the study that my comrades already mentioned were FENAREP in Peru, the Capón Landfill Waste Speaker Association in Accra, Ghana, and Sure We Can in New York. Waste Speakers, just for you to know if you are not familiar, they have two main places of work: the streets, the public space, where they can access recyclable materials, and the dump sites, where our waste ends up in most of the Global South countries. Across the 9 cities which study Waste Speakers, 60% of them were not able to work during the big lockdowns or restrictions in April, as happened in most of the sectors already mentioned. The 3 main reasons were restrictions on movements and work, 75%, health concerns, 40%, and disruptions to the waste supply chain, 37%. As Jambi was saying, also the global recycling supply chain collapsed for a while. Even when they managed to access some recyclables, there was no place to sell them. So imagine the desperation that these workers were facing over a couple of months. Still, across the 4 sectors, Waste Speakers experienced the greatest recovery of average earnings by mid-2020. Maybe, and this is my hypothesis, maybe because we are also producing a lot of more waste because of the pandemic. However, it should be noted that pre-COVID-19, they earned the least of all sectors in most of the 9 cities. Over 60% of the Waste Speakers reported that they faced greater occupational health risks by mid-2020 than pre-COVID. More than half of them reported additional costs for transport and for security measures to protect their waste materials from being stolen, and just over 1/3 reported additional fines and fees. Imagine that not only they were the workers most exposed to handling the virus through our own infected objects discharged, they were also in need of protecting these as if they were precious objects. This is how unfair things can be. Like street vendors, there was also gender differentiation in how the crisis impacted Waste Speakers, with women Waste Speakers having lower earnings pre-COVID, experiencing even a higher drop in earnings in April, as well as a slower recovery by mid-year. This reflects how women are often found in low-earning roles within the sector, how the whole caring system has collapsed, as you all know, without access to even school in most of cases. As an example, the Bangladesh Waste Speaker Trade Union, mostly composed of women, they have experienced a great loss in their income. They literally had no access to materials at the beginning of the pandemic, on top of which they were forced to carry their own children to the dump site with them because there were no other place to leave them. Their president, Rena, told us they were starving and seeking for help, literally, and we are not hearing from Rena since a month and a half now, and we are really trying to see what's going on there. But because sometimes crises open opportunities to strengthen organizing. Sometimes from desperation and cracks is where the lights get in, as the Leonard Cohen poem says. We managed to set up a global ad hoc committee of waste speakers in response to COVID-19 at the beginning of the pandemic in order to provide some support. We are now sustaining a process among waste speakers organizations around the world where relief and solidarity is taking place, where we can support each other in the daily struggle, as well as hear from new trends emerging in the which are creating new threats and menace for waste speakers' livelihoods, particularly women. Because as Naomi Klein says in the Shock Doctrine, the capitalism always finds the new ways of emerging within the crisis. So those I mentioned before that have no access to materials since the beginning of the pandemic are now suffering the menace of an incineration plant in Dhaka. So we are helping to ensure the government supports them instead of opening the door to new privatization patterns and new ways for capitalists to extract value from waste that belongs historically to the poor. Same is happening in Accra, Ghana, one of the studies that in the mentioned study, where another waste-to-energy plant is trying to get sold there, and waste speakers are organizing strongly against it. But we don't need to travel that far. In Paris, Samuel, the president of the Waste Speaker Association, very active in the Global Alliance process, by the way, he mentioned at the beginning of the pandemic, we can't get a social dialogue for a year now. We're insulted. Elected officials keep rejecting waste speakers that work in the streets. Our association, Amelior, has been showing that social inclusion is important, but every time they are sending the police and private companies to remove us. We have no markets open because of the lockdown. All waste speakers are feeling more poverty now than before. And to finish with the words of Sushila Ben, our waste speaker member of Street Mukti Sangatana in India, which means Women Liberation Organization, what will happen with the children of those parents dying of COVID? Poor people do not get beds in the hospitals. They don't get oxygen. What happened here was very wrong. How long are we going to be suffering like this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucia, and thanks to all of our excellent panelists for your very powerful interventions and very clear summaries of what are really some striking findings from across the regions and the sectors. I'd like to pose now a few questions that have arisen, and what I propose is I'll pose 3 questions, and then I'll go through the panelists in the same order to respond. But the first, before I do that, what I'd like to do is, sorry, I'm just checking my sound here. What I'd first like to do is offer a couple of just reminders or concluding comments. First of all, I want to call attention to Lucia's point that within each occupational sector, you tend to find women in the lower status positions inside of each sector. And that's something that we see across all of the sectors, and that again shows us how the impact of a pandemic that affects everyone will affect women disproportionately because they're inserted into those lower status roles within the sectors. Also, Jonavie's comment that recovery has been faster for workers in who are members of cooperatives, and this shows us really the power of the collective, and we've seen that across the sectors as well, and something that Myrtle mentioned among domestic workers too, and what their organizations are doing. I want to highlight Oksana's point about nothing for us without us. This is the approach that workers' organizations use to working with governments on setting policies. And then Myrtle's comment about the need really for governments to just be involved, understand the sectors, and work with the sector organizations. So with that in mind, let me pose a few questions to the panelists. First of all, what would recovery look like for workers in your sector? What are their needs and what are their demands at this point in the crisis? We've talked about what happened early on. What's happening now? Second question, what has changed to that point since last June and July when these studies were conducted? What's the situation? And then third, what are your networks prioritizing for economic recovery among your members, given what their needs are? So you can pick which question you'd like to respond to, and let's just go around the room again, starting with Myrtle. We have about maybe 2 minutes each. Myrtle, over to you. Can everybody hear me?
I think, listening to all these powerful speakers and listening to what come out, we all find that was a loss of income, it was social protection, it was a lot of things that happening to the sector, the vulnerable sector. So in actual fact, we have to start, like I said in the beginning, we have to start thinking of a way forward. And clearly, a way forward is to look at, like we said in the domestic sector, it's not a matter anymore about a handout. It's not a matter anymore about a food coupon. It's a matter of to teach us about projects and to teach us about how to survive and how to care for the vulnerable domestic workers. And I think in that way, we also will empower the domestic workers to start thinking about how we can assist one another and how we can better our own life. And I think a lot of things we'll have to do with education and workshops and how we can conquer this new world. And for me, that is what is vitally important today, is that to make sure that we get that support for the vulnerable sector, because as we know, that there is many out there to suffer more. That's how the way I see it, and that's what I heard from all of us. It's about survival and how we can, support ourselves and go forward. And of course, social protection. We must make sure in November, when we take that floor, that social protection will be for all.
Thank you, Myrtle. Well said. Over to you, Genevieve.
Right. On International Home-Based Workers Day, we had this huge gathering of home-based workers across the world, and we discussed about recovery. And some of them were very prompt to respond that recovery hasn't even started. After 1 year of the pandemic, actually workers are more vulnerable than ever before, even at the starting of the pandemic. Last year, there was still some sense of hope, but right now, a lot of workers are dealing with grief. Their own family members are dying, their comrades, colleagues are dying. So there's a lot of grief within the sector itself. There's so much of uncertainty of what's going to happen next. The manufacturing industry is doing very badly. Home-based workers are dependent on manufacturing sector also. So, so there's a lot of uncertainty that is there. The organizations are shutting down. Smaller organizations, trade unions, membership-based organizations are struggling to survive. Cooperatives and producer companies, while they're doing well, much better than other organizations, but they're also struggling for access to markets and to make themselves sustainable. Now, in a situation like this, we have 5 key demands. The workers are talking about, first and foremost, is recognition as workers. Home-based workers are the least recognized workers within the informal economy also. The second is access to work and income. Most home-based workers are not able to recover, so that is very important. The third is universalization of social protection. They're more vulnerable than ever before, and we need to really see that, home-based workers were not very well. They had a lot of challenges before COVID-19. Now, what is the road that we want to take forward? In fact, a lot of them are now talking about, we need to relook at economic structures. We need to relook at the global supply chains, and we need to really promote the worker-led models of cooperatives and producer companies who are able to support workers at this stage. And the fifth demand, and the last one that we have, is access to health and vaccines. They're very far away from say, even the testing that's happening or the vaccination drives that are happening. These are very uneven rollouts, and they're demanding for that. Last, you'd also asked, Sally, about, what are our networks prioritizing at the moment. First and foremost for us, organizing is very important, and solidarity building is because we're a very new network. We are trying to find how to work together and strengthen our voices. The next is to promote economic models that work, and like the cooperative models and the social solidarity economy models, and have campaigns specifically around recognition and social protection. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Janavi. Over to you, Oksana.
Thank you, Sally. Yes, as we can see that pandemic only amplified, let's say, or strengthened already existing situation or tendencies which existed before COVID-19. And the same applies to our sector. If informal economy situation was very bad, so it became even much worse. And this is what also resonates with previous speakers about how difficult it is, how more vulnerable they became. But as for moving forward, of course, we have to move forward, and we believe that intervention strategies with governments, including with local governments, should be inclusive, transparent, simple, universally accessible, and non-discriminatory. We revealed many gaps, and one of them is lack of data at national level. Of course, databases is very important, so inclusive information needs to be collected at local government level according to different sectors of informal economy. The other issue is public space, which usually is a working space for our sector, for street vendors and market vendors. So developing a just framework for the management of public spaces, both at workplaces and as a public transport transit spaces. So public space can also be useful for health screening. Then another issue is monitoring and following implementation of health measures as informal economy workers get back to work in public space and keep them safe in their workspaces as part of the process of getting economies working again. Elimination of red tape is a big and bureaucratic issue to ensure that informal work startups are not frustrated by bureaucratic administrative difficulties. We also demand to stop evictions and harassment of informal traders, especially with regard to gender-based violence. One of the most also relevant issue is smart investment in free Wi-Fi for all, including in slum and rural areas, just due to technological progress. So, and building relationship with other sectors and with governmental agencies just to enable dialogue space at all levels, including at local and national level. So we know that the transition from informal to formal economy needs to be fast-tracked in the process of our post-lockdown economic recovery in line with the rights-based ILO recommendation 204, and definitely a bottom-up economic recovery program is essential. So no economic recovery without us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oksana. And for the final word, we hand it over to Lucia. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, first I will say to recognize, try for waste speakers to be recognized as public service providers, where nobody was out there cleaning the streets and try to get our cities clean. Waste speakers were there together with public officers, together with the waste management officers from local governments, but they need this recognition as they are cleaning our cities around the world. We are also trying to strengthen our global unity. try to understand some common enemies that we are having. We are provide a lot of capacity building towards these organizations that are facing strong threats and menace of dispossession of their materials by capitalist accumulation on these new companies that are coming from their waste. So as Silvio Ruiz says in Colombia, the waste speakers without access to waste are fishermen that have no access to fish. You cannot survive if you cannot guarantee the access of recycled materials. And something that we are fighting harder for is to have fair and inclusive extended producer responsibility systems where companies that are the ones polluting the environment and creating a lot of waste out there, they are paying for the responsibility, they are paying for their externalities in the environment, and waste speakers can have the compensation that they deserve for the decades and histories of cleaning our city and our world.
Thank you very much, Lucia, and thanks to all of our panelists and all of you participants in the audience. We really appreciate you being here. It's been an honor, and thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.